Hey folks, welcome to Carbon Garage, which today comes to you from a real garage. We're going to look at an interesting thing today. So in an earlier video I talked about earth points and just generally electrical problems being a little bit of a challenge with some TVRs. It's kind of their Achilles heel, to be honest. And over the last couple of weeks I've had a few symptoms crop up which kind of suggested that maybe there's going to be a bad earth somewhere on this car. So I did a lot of sort of digging about and research trying to figure out what that was. The nature of it meant it was a really difficult thing to film kind of while I did it. But we're going to look back retrospectively and sort of look at what I diagnosed, what I looked at, and just generally what I did to identify and then ultimately resolve this issue. So the issue that I actually had was, it was an electrical thing which impacted the lights, the indicators and the wipers. And those three things don't necessarily have much in common when you think about it on the surface. Like the lighting circuit and your wiper circuit are two completely different things. And what I was seeing was, this is actually an issue I first had many years ago and it never really came back, so I didn't really care about it. But when I turned my lights on, the wipers started sweeping and all four indicators sort of came on with like a solid glow. And the issue kind of resolved itself. Like it stayed for a little while, like it stayed for the rest of that journey, but I kind of just jiggled about some of the wiring which runs in the front bumper area, and that seemed to solve it. But it was kind of one of these things where it seemed to solve it, but I didn't really know if that was coincidence or if it was just that kind of once the car cooled down, it was all good. But like I say, that issue never came back, and it was sort of several years later then I started seeing things again. And while that issue itself hadn't come back, what I was starting to see was when I put an indicator on, let's say I indicated left, for a very brief moment, the right-hand indicator light would just flicker ever so slightly on the dashboard. And sometimes like going over bumps, especially if the lights were on at night, you would just sort of see one of the two indicator lights on the dash just flicker ever so slightly. It's not enough current going through the system that the actual lights on the sides of the car were flashing, because also they're much bigger bulbs that require a bit more current going through them to actually present some sort of presentable light. But the ones on the dash are much smaller and they were obviously getting enough to just sort of make something visible. So it was quite an annoying issue, but it wasn't really something that you couldn't live with. It was something I wanted to fix, but a sort of a random glowing light every once in a while is just not really that big a problem. You can kind of deal with it. So I had that for a couple of months, but then what I started to get was very occasionally when I was indicating I went over a bump, the wipers would do essentially three sweeps. I think it was the equivalent as if you were to spray the window with water, and they do the three sort of sweeps that they do before they stop. It was kind of doing that, and not the worst thing in the world, but it's super annoying. Like you don't want wipers going across your window when there's no water on it, because it just ends up, at best it smears all the bugs and stuff which are on it, which at this time of year there's absolutely loads, but you run the risk of it scratching the window as well, plus it's just generally a bit of a pain. And what I often find with that is, for some reason when they finish their sweeps at the end of that, they would often park a little bit too high on the window, which is a little bit annoying as well. In fact, if you watch carefully in one of the earlier videos I did, I think it was the one where I looked at the quirks of this car, you'll see when the car is parked at the side of the road, the wipers are parked maybe 1 or 2 centimeters higher up than they really should have been, and that's why. So this started to become a little bit more common, and then after I changed the brake pads, went out for a quick test drive the other night when it was sun was just starting to set. So the lights were on and I got the issues I had before where the wiper started and the indicators came on. Fortunately it wasn't quite so dark yet, so I just switched down to side lights and just got home. I was only like 5-10 minutes away, so it wasn't too big a problem. But that kind of marked the point where yeah, I've now got to properly try and figure out what this problem actually is. And when I started getting those issues the first time, I did a little bit of research and saw that the most likely thing was one of the earths that sits at the front of the chassis rails, at the front of the engine bay, which I'll show you in a second. And it looked quite likely that was kind of what the problem was, but the issue is that on probably every Chimaera, to be honest with you, that chassis bolt sits underneath the bottom radiator hose, which makes it basically impossible to see what was actually going on, and it makes it impossible to get a spanner or a socket or anything onto it, because it's a really tight space and you just can't get your hand in, you can't see it, so you're pretty much screwed with it. So before I started really digging into that and having the hassle of potentially taking the radiator out, I tried various other things. I tried just sort of playing about with some relays, even just switching the indicators on and off rapidly, just to see if I could get a stuck relay to free off a little bit. But nothing seemed to make any real difference. So let's take a quick look at this sort of area of the engine bay just to get a sense of what it's like, and then we'll kind of talk about what I actually ended up doing to fix it. So using my phone as a torch here. Let's see if we can actually get some light on the area where we want it. And the thing is, this is a very hard thing to see, which is kind of being proven here. But you can see the bottom radiator hose there, the right hand one, which is blue, and you can just about see the front of the body, which is the sort of the slightly lighter part you can see immediately to the left of it. You can see the anti-roll bar with the bush here, and underneath, kind of right in the middle of the screen right now, that is where the bolt sits. And that sort of shows the extent of the problem in trying to actually get to this new thing with it. On the other side, which you can just about see, down here, if the camera wants to focus on the right bit, there we go, that's the equivalent bolt on the other side. So if the earth went to that side, it would be super easy to do something with it. But of course, somebody decided that the length of wire should be short, and therefore it has to go to the one that you can't actually get to. So before we go a little bit further, let's just look at why the earth issues on these cars are as common a problem as they are, and why something like the Abarth won't ever really experience these sorts of issues. And it comes down to the fact that this body is made of fiberglass. And obviously that's quite unusual. Most cars' bodies are made of metal. And if you think about, imagine a car battery, and you've got the two terminals on it, a positive and a negative. Your negative terminal essentially gets earth to the body. Quite often in an engine bay, you'll see the battery somewhere maybe here, and you'll see a very heavy duty wire just run to a bolt somewhere on the body. And that essentially means that the entire body of the car acts as an earth. So your positive terminal will ultimately get split down and all the individual sort of circuits on the car will get fed from that. But the negative just earths on the entire body, which means that when you've got something like a light bulb, you literally just take the positive that you've got, connect that up, and then take from the negative side to any part of the body, and it will act as the earth. But of course, on a fiberglass car, you can't have that because fiberglass doesn't conduct electricity. So you end up having sort of dedicated earth points about the car. There's something like 4 on a Chimaera. And that means that every circuit essentially goes to one of 4 places. And generally speaking, well actually exclusively, these will ultimately earth through the chassis because the equivalent to the metal body is the metal chassis, and that negative earth, or that negative strap from the battery goes to the chassis. So there's one at the front, there's one, I think there's actually 2 in the transmission tunnel area, and there's also one by the fuel tank at the back. But the one at the front is probably the one which is most exposed to the elements. It sits right at the front, it's next to the radiator, so it's going to get super hot, which means things expand, dirt and other stuff can get in as well, and it's not the nicest place for something like that to be. Which is obviously why after just a few years of this car having a new chassis and having a nice shiny new bolt put in there, it was starting to sort of corrode and go a little bit funny already. But the thing is, I really didn't want to actually end up draining the radiator and taking it out. It's just not really worth the hassle of draining it all down, trying to capture all the fluids, because there's not a nice easy drain plug on these cars. You kind of just have to disconnect the hose and just try and route it into some sort of big container or something. You've then got the hassle of filling up, properly bleeding it and everything. It's just a hassle you can really do without if you can avoid it. So I tried as much as possible to try and move that blue hose within the solid pipes either side, to try and just move it as far away as possible, just to have some chance of actually getting to that bolt underneath. And I had moderate success with that, and I think it probably would have been like technically possible to get something on there and get that bolt out, but it was just going to be so difficult, and just all of your arms, everything is such an awkward space to walk into. You just get so many cuts, so many bruises. Like it's a week on and I've still got scratches there, 3 bruises across there, just from trying to contort into such an awkward space. So before sort of committing any further to it, what I wanted to do is just establish, A, does this car actually earth there? Obviously every TVR, because they're handmade, there can be lots of little subtle differences on them. So there's every chance that on this car it was earthing somewhere different. And B, because this car's had chassis work done to it, given this is such an awkward location, it would have made sense when that work was done that they'd rerouted the earth to somewhere that wasn't quite so awkward to get to. So before I committed to disconnecting a hose and doing all that stuff I didn't want to do, I just wanted to actually verify, 1, is the earth there, and 2, is there anything to suggest it's actually corroded? So I got an endoscope camera, and with a lot of sort of faffing about and trying to route this thing correctly, managed to get it down to where I wanted it so I could see the end of that bolt. And as you can see in this picture, yeah, that bolt was actually pretty corroded. You can see the earth going to it as well. So at that point, I was kind of satisfied that this is actually worth the effort of basically draining the coolant down. And doing so was a relatively simple process. Like I say, it's just a bit of a pain to do it. Disconnect that hose, big container underneath the car, and then just let it drain out. Getting that rubber hose off was relatively easy. You know, sometimes these hoses can be really, really difficult because they kind of just stick onto everything. I think the fact they're silicone rather than actually being rubber makes it a little bit easier. And the fact that just a few thousand miles ago, these hoses would all have been off the car as part of the chassis work. And I suspect when the specialist to take the car to does a 12,000 mile service, which involves a coolant flush, I'm pretty sure that they'll be disconnecting that hose as their means of doing that. So once the hose was off, it was still quite awkward to get into this bolt, but between a spanner and a socket, the bolt's quite long as well, so you've got to unthread it quite a long way. But between the two, eventually did manage to pull it out and then sort of made the effort of cleaning it up. To clean something like that up, I suppose you've got a couple of options. You could potentially just replace it with new parts. If you were to get a new bolt and new washer, then you could just put them straight on. But to be honest, it's probably not really necessary. Something like a little bit of wet and dry, or what I ultimately ended up using was a very fine grinding stone on a Dremel tool, which is just really good, just very quick, just to cut back the surface rust on the bolt. Clean it all up, get it looking like new, and then put it back in. I did consider then covering the whole thing in something like HT grease just to try and give it a bit more protection from the elements. But what I found when I took it off, it actually wasn't as tight as it probably should have been. So I suspect that because it wasn't tight, there was just an opportunity for water and things to get into places where they otherwise wouldn't. The electrical connections themselves that go onto that, which there's two, they were both completely clean, so there was no need to actually do anything with them. Which is kind of fortunate because there's not a lot of flex on those wires. So if you imagine like this is kind of the bottom part of the radiator area there, it kind of sits there, and there's probably only about that much sort of flex, probably not even that on these wires. And because it's so awkward and so far down, if you did have to clean them up, it would be a really, really difficult thing to do. To be honest, I don't really know how you'd actually manage to get in there and to do that. You'd probably have to take the radiator out to actually get enough access to do something worthwhile. And while that's not a big job, again, it's a bit more of a pain to have to do it. So I got it all back together. Before I filled it up with the coolant, I'll just make sure all the stuff works. Turned the ignition on, and because I had this relatively common issue with the turning indicator on, see the other one flash very briefly, checked that, everything was good, and at that point, you know, I'm pretty confident this is solved. Bit of awkwardness to try and get the hoses back on, but it's kind of just brute force to actually get everything where it needs to be. Fill up the system, you go through the standard bleeding procedure for this car. Depending where you read, you'll see slightly different things, but basically you've got the swirl pot over here. Fill that one up until it's absolutely full with your coolant. At the side of the radiator you have your bleed screw here. Take that out completely, and then because this is the highest point in the system where you're filling up, it will eventually bleed out of this one. Keep pouring until you start seeing no air, and then the key thing is to keep this reservoir completely full. Once there's no air coming out of this, you just sort of screw that back up. Start the car up, and to get it up to temperature, make sure the cooling fans come on, and then switch it off, let it all cool down again, and then within your sort of expansion bottle here, make sure that's still got plenty of coolant in it. Every car will generally sit with its own sort of natural level within that. In this car it's around about 50%, but you kind of just want to make sure that that is not dropping down, because obviously if there's any air in the system, that will be where the drop represents itself essentially. So yeah, it was a relatively simple task, other than ripping my arm to shreds to get that done. All in all, it probably took about 2 hours start to finish, including getting the tools out and that sort of thing. But it's good, you know, it's a really annoying issue which has now been solved on the car, and I'm very happy that I can now drive at night with my lights on without having to worry about strange things happening. So yeah, that's the first sort of technical issue that I've ever really had with this car. It's the first thing which has really sort of been annoying, and it was quite an easy thing to fix. And after, well, I'm in my 5th year of ownership now, 4 full years and a little bit, to have nothing else really go wrong, I think it really is sort of testament to how nicely made these cars are. I'm not going to say well made, because I think any sort of handmade thing is going to be made to different standards to a mass-produced car. But as I said in another video, almost everything on it is an off-the-shelf part, so you don't really expect it to fail. And the way that the wiring is done is really the only thing which is properly different, and it's probably also the only thing which is quite questionable. And we'll maybe cover that in another video when we look at this, at the big mess of wiring that sits in the passenger footwell and the ECU, which is kind of just tucked in at the side and isn't fixed in anywhere, and things like that. But yeah, relatively simple thing to fix, happy with the result. And it's not a super common issue, but it's definitely not unheard of. So if you've got similar symptoms on your car with wipers and lights and indicators and potentially even the horn all interfering with each other, that's what you want to do. You don't have to take it to a dealer to do it. It's a relatively simple DIY job. You don't need any specialist tools. So yeah, recommend that you give it a go. If you found this video useful, then please like, comment and subscribe. We've got plenty more content with this car and other ones coming up over the next wee while, so don't miss out. Make sure you click that subscribe button. And yeah, have a good day. Enjoy the summer while it's here.